Humanity in Crisis will bring to you some of the biggest issues that exist in our world today, shedding light on different crises from poverty and HIV/AIDS through to gender equality and recession. Human history has experienced untold conflict and very little has changed today. We stepped into the new millennium with much of the world consumed in war, resulting in millions of lives lost, causing a tremendous amount of suffering, devastation, large-scale displacement and social and economic upheaval. Can clashes between communities and between countries ever be eradicated, or is this notion just a fantasy? In today's programme, we'll be focusing on conflict zones, the root causes, the shocking effects of war, and the impact both locally and globally. But first, let's see what the British public know about conflict zones.
Conflict zone? I'm not sure at all. A zone that has a high rate of conflict within it for a large number of years.
Most immediate thing is Iraq and Afghanistan, the conflict zones there.
Problem area, maybe like a community or a country that's at war or fighting each other.
Areas where a lot of people are getting killed.
The Geneva Conventions, which are at the core of international humanitarian law, recognise that any difference arising between two or more armed parties is an armed conflict. This can be of an international or a non-international nature. Conflict within a state or between two or more separate states can arise for a variety of reasons, those reasons often being unclear and difficult to comprehend. I caught up with Dr. Nafiz Ahmed, commentator on geopolitics, to get an insight into the root causes of conflict.
Conflict is not an essential part of human nature. People have a choice to either include other communities or to fight with them. And the things that drive this kind of conflict are not just religion or ethnicity, which is often assumed, but in fact deeper issues to do with social crisis, the way that economic crisis or economic collapse can affect communities, or political crisis and collapse, or even cultural crisis and collapse. And these can often force people to challenge the way they think about things and look for alternative ways of doing things, whether it's to fight with others or to cooperate with them.
The United Nations Environment Programme reports that over the last 60 years, at least 40% of all internal conflicts have been linked to the exploitation of natural resources such as oil, gold, timber and diamonds. Where conflicts arise, mass violations of human rights inevitably follow, but you may be shocked to learn who is most at risk. We asked the public what they thought.
Civilians, children, women, people that aren't actually part of the military.
The one who is fighting the war.
It tends to be the civilians at the moment because the military or the rebels tend to be fairly well armed and protected, so collateral damage to civilians tends to be the major problem.
The children and families, really.
I suppose families must be quite affected by that kind of thing, because I know conflict zones kind of tear apart families, children, mothers, that kind of thing.
Innocent families, people who are unaware of the reasons for the war or unprepared to protect themselves.
The United Nations Security Council notes that being a woman in armed conflict is more dangerous than being a soldier. Civilians are indeed affected, but women and children suffer the most.
Armed conflict primarily affects civilians, obviously, by killing them, but it can often be more complex than that. Modern warfare inevitably means that civilians end up being killed due to the nature of modern weaponry, which can be quite indiscriminate. But apart from that, often civilians end up being the brunt of conflict due to the targeting of critical infrastructure in order to win the war. So water facilities, sanitation, health, roads, other kinds of infrastructure often are targeted in war, and that can often affect civilians very badly. The other thing is that women are also often targeted specifically through rape, which can be very devastating.
According to the World Health Organization, gender-based violence accounts for more death and disability among women between 15 and 44 years old than the combined effect of cancer, malaria, traffic injuries and war. Bullets and bombs are not the only weapons of war. Rape is too. Mass rape in war has been documented in Bosnia, Rwanda, Liberia and Sudan. And the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the most deadly ever documented in Africa, claiming an estimated 6 million lives since 1998. In this multifaceted conflict, women's bodies are the battleground. A study published by the American Journal of Public Health in May 2011 states that roughly 400,000 rapes are committed each year in the DR Congo. Doctors on Call for Service, or DOCS, is a local hospital set up in 1995. With the support of UNICEF, it has become a refuge for raped and abused women.
This has become a culture of violence. Since '92, this region has been racked by violence, and it's becoming a culture of violence. So taking what you want by force, whether it's goods, whether it's other people's cattle, whether it's their land, their wife, or their child, it is happening all the time. Something needs to put a stop to this culture of violence.
On arrival at DOCS, they are immediately screened for sexually transmitted infections. Antiretroviral drugs that reduce the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS must be taken within 72 hours of sexual intercourse. However, most women have had to walk 4 days to reach the hospital, and they are often too late. For the women who are successfully treated and recover physically, returning to a normal life will never be easy. Beseme's village was attacked one night by the Interahamwe, and amongst them were young men from her village. They were afraid that she might recognize them, so after attacking her, they beat her so she lost sight in one eye and the other one was badly damaged. With no system in place, the culprits are rarely caught, and with each military group blaming others, responsibility for violence is never accepted, even when captured and with many allegations against them.
Rero hari regoroma igenga icyo gisirikare twabagamo cya FDLR ko umuntu ufashwe umugore bamuhanisha igihano cyo kumwica. Ubwo abantu rero bafata abagore n'abahita bigumura bakava muri abo basirikare bakajya ku ruhande, ubwo nibo bakora ibyo bikorwa ahari bibageraho niko ngewe.
Victims of war rape are not only psychologically scarred for life, but endure traumatic physical injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, and persistent gynecological problems and maternal mortality. Destroying a woman's body shreds family foundations, causing the community's social fabric to disintegrate. Displaced women and children are further endangered as they tend to be targets for organised crime. A United Nations report states that forcibly displaced women and children are extremely susceptible to exploitation by traffickers. Impunity, lawlessness, dysfunctional state institutions, and weak border controls are all conducive to high levels of trafficking of people and drugs from conflict zones. The huge profits generated through these illegal crimes even rival some countries' GDP, threatening state authority, regularly undermining United Nations peacebuilding efforts, financing terrorist groups, and fueling civil wars. Many children lose their homes, their families and communities, and they experience extreme physical and emotional trauma. Some boys as young as 7 years old are forcibly recruited as soldiers by militia and rebel groups. What does life hold for these children?
What happens to the children? Again, the straightforward answer is it varies hugely. You get some children who are deeply, deeply traumatized by what they have experienced. I mean, I've worked with children who've been forced to do things that, that they find very difficult to describe. I was one young man I worked with who, for a long time, told me that he hadn't really done anything bad when he'd been with the rebels. And then one night, in the dark, in a displacement camp, when that camp was actually being attacked, he began to tell me about how he'd been forced to kill. And the way he was forced to kill was that each time the rebels killed someone, they cut the head off and they strapped it around his neck, so that in the end he was walking around with maybe a score of severed heads around his neck until he was willing to kill someone himself. Now that boy was screaming out in the dark, remembering what happened to him. How do we assess what this sort of effect has and what kind of effect this has on people? It's very, very hard. It's clear that people are deeply disturbed. On the other hand, many of those people who are recruited into those armed factions, they've had a pretty miserable life. They're living in a displacement camp. One particular camp I worked in northern Uganda, people were basically living in their own excrement. I mean, the morbidity and mortality rates were as high as I've seen anywhere. To join the rebel group, for many people there, was an opportunity, an escape from that world. So one shouldn't underestimate the degree to which young people see in those armed factions a way of life that provides them with new opportunities. Makes it very difficult to reintegrate them when the conflict ends, if it ever does.
Even though civilians are not active members of a conflict, it's clear that they're the ones that are most affected. Yet, very rarely are they included in peace talks and negotiations. Who should be representing them and protecting their human rights?
It's absolutely clear that it's primarily the responsibility of the state where those civilians are to protect those civilians. And there are two aspects to this: a positive duty to take steps to ensure that protection, and a negative duty not to interfere with the rights of those civilians. There is, in 2005, a UN-established initiative known as the Responsibility to Protect, and that recognises three things. One, that it's a primary duty of the state to protect. Secondly, foreign states may assist where that state is not carrying out its duty. And thirdly, if there is a complete failure by the state to carry out the duty to protect, then there may be scope, first of all, for economic sanctions and military intervention as a very last resort.
The end of World War II saw 50 member states of the United Nations come together to draft the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. Despite most countries having ratified the Charter, international law proves hard to implement due to lack of resources and accessibility to the general public. The impact of conflict can be far-reaching, affecting not only neighbouring countries but further afield too. The involvement in wars has cost the UK billions of pounds year upon year. I caught up with our expert to see how conflict has impacted on the UK and its economy.
The UK is often heavily involved in conflicts in the global community, whether it's through the fact that Britain has interests in the countries where these conflicts are taking place, or whether it's because of the international arms trade, or many other reasons. And that can often be quite costly because often it involves the involvement of the armed forces to deal with these conflicts, or humanitarian aid, or it can be costly in British lives when people perceive that Britain is involved as a problem and they want to target Britain and British public in order to kind of get people out to address their grievances. So it can be costly in many different ways.